A young queen, worn down by years of relentless coughing and a body ravaged by lung disease, passed away at just 42 within the cold walls of Stockholm's royal palace. Louise of the Netherlands, daughter of a king, wife of a king, yet she knew only loneliness, loss, and despair. Her silent death concealed a tragedy the court chose to forget. The fate of a queen remembered not for power, but for the sorrow that consumed her life. Louise of the Netherlands entered the world on August 5, 1828, in The Hague. The city was stately, dignified, and slightly austere, more a political capital than a place of warmth. She was born into a palace where duty was stitched into every curtain, where portraits of ancestors lined the halls like silent judges. Her father, King William II of the Netherlands, embodied the pragmatism and military rigor of a monarch whose throne depended on stability in a fragile kingdom. Her mother, Grand Duchess Anna Pavlovna of Russia, carried the weight of the Romanov dynasty, a woman raised in the icy splendor of St. Petersburg, whose eyes never quite softened even in her adopted country. From the moment of her birth, Louise was not only a child, but a symbol. She was a bridge between two dynasties, two traditions, two climates of power. The Dutch crown looked to her as a link to Europe's greater royal houses, and the Romanovs regarded her as a living reminder that their blood ran deep across the continent. Her childhood was not one of carefree play in sunlit gardens. Instead, it was framed by rigid etiquette. The palace at The Hague was orderly, but not intimate. Tutors guided her days with languages, music, and history lessons. She learned French and German, the lingua franca of courts, before she truly mastered Dutch. Her mother, Anna Pavlovna, instilled in her a Russian sense of formality, sternness mixed with spirituality, an emphasis on obedience and piety. Laughter was not forbidden, but it was rare. In these years, Louise became what contemporaries described as delicate. She was slender, pale, and easily fatigued. The courtiers whispered about her fragile health. The child's body carried hints of weakness that foreshadowed her fate. A chest that grew weary in winter, a tendency to cough during cold spells, a quiet demeanor that mirrored both physical and emotional restraint. Yet, within her fragility, there was a sharp awareness. Louise was intelligent, observant, perhaps too much so. She recognized early that her place in life was not hers to choose. She was, as many 19th century princesses were, a chess piece on the board of Europe. A union of dynasties, a promise of political harmony, a future bride who would bind nations together while her own heart was left unheard. This realization was not sudden. It seeped into her childhood like dampness into the palace walls. She watched as envoys came and went, discussing treaties and marriages, speaking of alliances in the same breath as they spoke of crops and taxes. She watched her brothers, who would inherit titles and command armies, treated as if their futures were solid stone. She, in contrast, was a future wrapped in uncertainty. Her value was not in what she would rule, but in whom she would marry. Her mother never hid this. Anna Pavlovna believed deeply in dynastic destiny. She had married across borders herself, leaving Russia for the Low Countries, and she carried both pride and resentment for it. To her daughter, she imparted the lesson: your life is not yours. It belongs to history. Louise, shy by nature, did not rebel. She internalized. She turned inward. She grew into a young woman who rarely raised her voice, who seemed to walk softly even across the marble floors of the palace. Her portraits from youth show her with downcast eyes, an oval face framed by smooth hair, her expression quiet, almost resigned. If beauty was expected of royal brides, Louise offered instead gentleness and modesty, virtues that courts often praised aloud while privately undervaluing. Still, there were moments of warmth. She found solace in books, particularly poetry and religious texts. She played piano with a tender, unshowy touch. She enjoyed embroidery, the slow act of weaving thread into order when the rest of her world felt preordained. Within these small pursuits, she carved a pocket of selfhood, a private kingdom. Her father, King William II, saw in her a daughter to be protected, but not indulged. His military career and his turbulent reign left little space for affection. Louise respected him, but their bond was more formal than tender. With her mother, she shared discipline but little intimacy. Thus, her siblings became her closest companions, though even there, distance crept in as each was groomed for their respective roles. By the late 1840s, as Louise entered her 20s, her future began to crystallize. Europe was restless. Revolutions broke out in 1848, shaking thrones from Paris to Vienna. Monarchs looked for stability through marriage alliances, and the Dutch crown knew that their quiet daughter might serve as a link to secure influence abroad. In whispers and letters, the name of Crown Prince Karl of Sweden and Norway began to circle. For Louise, the prospect was daunting. Sweden was far away, colder even than Holland. Its court was Lutheran, rigid, and steeped in traditions unfamiliar to her. Crown Prince Karl was known for charm, but also for indulgence, a man of passions and extramarital affairs, even before marriage. She had never met him, but already she knew. This was not about her heart. It was about dynastic math, about the ledger of alliances that could not be balanced without her signature. Here lies the tragedy at its quiet beginning. Louise of the Netherlands, gentle and frail, raised in duty and silence, was being guided toward a destiny not her own. She did not resist. How could she? The 19th century did not reward princesses who demanded autonomy. Instead, she folded her dreams like pressed flowers into the pages of her diary and prepared to step across borders into a colder fate. Her youth in The Hague had shaped her, disciplined, delicate, and deferential. Yet behind her quiet eyes, history was already closing its grip. She was not merely a daughter, not merely a princess. She was a vessel of alliance, a symbol of diplomacy, and a woman whose life would be remembered not for what she gained, but for what was taken from her. In the year 1850, Europe was still trembling from the aftershocks of revolution. Thrones had been shaken, monarchs forced to promise constitutions. Barricades had risen in cities from Paris to Berlin. Royal houses looked upon their daughters not as children of affection, but as anchors of stability, threads to stitch together the torn fabric of dynastic Europe. And it was in this climate that the name of Louise of the Netherlands was written beside that of Crown Prince Karl of Sweden and Norway. It was no love match. It was a transaction dressed in the garments of ceremony. Sweden and Norway, under the Bernadotte dynasty, sought a bride of good blood, Protestant faith, and political neutrality. The Netherlands offered exactly that. Louise, with her mixed Dutch and Romanov heritage, was considered respectable, a suitable queen to be. For the courts of Europe, the arrangement was logical. For Louise, it was a door closing on the faintest hope of self-determination. She was 22, a tender age when dreams still pulse quietly in the chest. And yet, when the proposal was made, she had no voice. The question was not posed to her as a choice, but as a fact. A letter, a nod, an instruction. Her mother, Anna Pavlovna, reminded her that destiny is not a matter of consent, but of duty. Her father, King William II, emphasized the honor of binding the House of Orange-Nassau to a northern throne. Between them, there was no space left for hesitation. Thus, the marriage contract was signed. The terms spoke of dowries and privileges, titles and residences. Absent from its pages was the word happiness. The wedding took place in June 1850 in Stockholm, with pomp that dazzled the city. Processions, banquets, church bells ringing over the harbor. Citizens filled the streets, curious to glimpse the foreign princess who had traveled north to bind her fate with theirs. Louise, pale and composed, stood beside Karl, who carried himself with confidence, his broad shoulders and striking face drawing more cheers than her modest figure. To the public, it was a triumph. Two kingdoms united in alliance, a princess crowned with duty, a prince assured of a bride who brought no political entanglements. The spectacle was convincing enough that the whispers of doubt were drowned out by the music of celebration. But to Louise, the grandeur of the day felt like a veil, thin, shimmering, and suffocating. Her new home was the Stockholm Royal Palace, a fortress-like structure of stone and cold halls. Unlike the Netherlands, with its softer Dutch manners and damp but mild climate, Sweden felt harsher. The winters were longer, darker, and the court more rigid. The air of Stockholm carried a chill that seemed to seep not only into her lungs, but into her spirit. Karl, her husband, was not a cruel man in public. He could be charming, affable, generous. But he was restless, a man of appetites. He enjoyed theaters, banquets, hunting, and women. From the beginning, he treated his marriage not as a bond, but as an obligation fulfilled. He visited her chamber dutifully, but rarely. His heart and passions wandered elsewhere, to salons and mistresses. Louise quickly realized that she was not entering a partnership, but a performance. At dinners, she was expected to smile softly, to answer politely, to embody grace without influence. At ceremonies, she wore the crown jewels, yet their weight reminded her only of how hollow her authority was. She was the queen-in-waiting, yet a ghost within the palace corridors. Letters home reveal the tone of resignation. To her mother, she wrote of the honor of my role and the kindness of the Swedish people. But between the lines lies a muted ache. She confessed feeling foreign, tired, lonely. She missed the familiar cadence of Dutch voices, the smaller rooms of The Hague that, for all their discipline, at least carried the scent of childhood. The courtiers observed her quietly. They called her polite, delicate, a little timid. Some thought she lacked presence, that she was overshadowed by her husband's charisma. They were not cruel, but their indifference cut deep. In a world where perception was power, Louise was perceived as inconsequential. And yet, within her, there was no rebellion. She endured. She embodied what was expected. That was perhaps her tragedy's root. She bore her pain silently, believing silence itself was duty. Unlike other queens who wielded influence behind curtains, Louise seemed to fold herself smaller, as if to avoid notice. She was, in the eyes of the court, a queen without a voice. But history teaches us that silence can wound as deeply as scandal. Every ignored glance, every absence of affection, every night alone in gilded chambers, these were the beginnings of the fractures that would shape her life. For Karl, the marriage was completed the moment the vows were spoken. For Louise, the marriage began that night, when she lay in her chamber listening to the hollow sound of the palace clock, realizing that her life would be measured not in joys, but in duties. And so the young Dutch princess became Crown Princess of Sweden and Norway. She exchanged her homeland for an icy kingdom, her private hopes for public obligations, her heart for silence. She carried herself with dignity, but dignity can be a heavy crown when unaccompanied by love. In retrospect, this union, so celebrated in 1850, was less a marriage and more a transaction of power. And Louise, gentle and fragile, was its currency. Her fate was sealed not by cruelty, but by indifference, and that, perhaps, is the crueler of the two. In 1859, 9 years after her marriage, the moment came that should have transformed Louise's life. Crown Prince Carl ascended the throne as King Charles V of Sweden and Norway. The coronation was marked by pageantry, the ringing of bells, and proclamations declaring a new era. And by his side, Louise was crowned Queen Consort. On paper, her position had changed dramatically. She was now the highest woman in the realm, the wife of the sovereign, the visible embodiment of monarchy's continuity. Yet, in reality, her life shifted little. Louise was queen, but without the threads of influence that had given other royal consorts a measure of power. She wore the crown, yes, but it was a hollow crown. Charles XV was charismatic and ambitious. He enjoyed politics, parliaments, and the admiration of the people. His speeches carried confidence. His reforms, though contested, showed energy. He belonged to the stage of history. Louise did not. She remained in the wings, present but silent, her role ceremonial. The Swedish court reflected this imbalance. Ministers, nobles, and courtiers gathered around the king. He was the axis. She was the shadow. Unlike queens in France or Austria, who sometimes acted as regents or advisors, Louise was not consulted on matters of governance. Her opinions were neither sought nor valued. Even her charitable projects, though sincere, were treated as side notes, distractions from the real business of state. It is tempting to imagine that she might have carved out influence in subtler ways, through patronage, whispers, alliances. But Louise was neither trained nor inclined to intrigue. She had been raised in obedience, in silence, in the discipline of subordination. The habits of childhood had calcified into adulthood. She moved with caution, spoke with restraint, lived as though she had been taught that invisibility was safer than visibility. And the courtiers noticed. They found her timid, almost invisible in gatherings. She lacked the fiery presence of some consorts, the sharp wit of others. They called her gentle, kind, delicate. Compliments, perhaps, but edged with dismissal. In a world where a queen's worth was measured by her ability to command attention, Louise was seen as failing the role. But there is another side to the story, one harder to articulate. For all her quietness, Louise carried herself with dignity. She was not foolish nor ignorant. She knew the role expected of her, to embody stability, to bear heirs, to maintain composure, and she did so. Yet history, cruel in its metrics, remembers not dignity, but dynamism. She was compared unfavorably to queens who schemed or inspired, and in that comparison, she was found wanting. Her foreignness deepened the problem. She was Dutch by birth, half Russian by blood. Though she spoke Swedish fluently, she would always be viewed as an outsider. Her manners were too reserved, her health too frail, her aura too distant. Stockholm's courtiers did not see her as one of their own. Even the people who admired Charles V rarely thought of her. To the public imagination, she was a name without a story. And then there was Charles himself. As king, his infidelities grew bolder. He pursued mistresses openly, fathered illegitimate children, and treated marital fidelity as a minor inconvenience. Society, bound by double standards, tolerated his behavior. The press looked away, the court adjusted, and Louise endured. What did it mean to be a queen in such a marriage? It meant hosting ceremonies while ignoring whispers. It meant sitting beside a husband who belonged more to others than to her. It meant watching her position diminished not by scandal, but by neglect. The wound was not public humiliation, but private abandonment. Louise's chambers in the royal palace became both her sanctuary and her prison. There, among gilded furniture and heavy drapes, she lived in isolation. The grandeur of her surroundings could not mask the silence of her evenings. Behind every tapestry, behind every polished marble floor, lay a void. A queen without influence, a wife without companionship, a woman without intimacy. And yet, she fulfilled her duties as best she could. She appeared at official occasions, dressed in silks and jewels. She attended church with solemn devotion. She visited hospitals, orphanages, and charities, giving donations with gentle words. She played the part of a queen whose heart was in service. But service could not compensate for solitude. In private correspondence, contemporaries described her as melancholy, sometimes visibly sad, with eyes that seemed to look past the present. A court diarist wrote, "Her Majesty is here, but not here. She walks as though the world is behind glass." To understand Louise's tragedy, one must grasp the paradox of queenship in the 19th century. A queen was expected to be both visible and invisible, powerful yet powerless, admired but never outspoken. Some women navigated this paradox with brilliance. Louise, by nature and nurture, could not. Her gentleness, which might have been cherished in private life, became her weakness in the machinery of monarchy. By 1860, less than a year into her husband's reign, the pattern was clear. Charles V ruled with vigor, indulged with abandon, and basked in public admiration. Louise, meanwhile, faded into the background. Her name was announced, her image painted, her title respected. But she was absent from the true script of power. And so history recorded her as she lived. A queen without power. Not because she lacked intelligence, not because she lacked dignity, but because the structures around her, the husband beside her, and the court before her never allowed her to be more. She was the embodiment of duty, stripped of agency, a crown without a throne, a voice never heard above the clamor of politics and passion. And in this silence, her health, already fragile, began to bend under the weight of loneliness. The queen who seemed to vanish in life would, in time, vanish in death. But for now, in the first years of Charles V's reign, her story had crystallized. A figure draped in velvet, standing in halls of gold, yet living as though she were carved from shadow. If Louise's queenship was marked by silence, her marriage was scarred by wounds that never healed. The gilded crown she wore in ceremonies could not disguise the truth. Her husband's love was absent, and in its place stood a parade of mistresses, scandals, and whispered rumors that traveled like smoke through Stockholm's court. King Charles V, handsome and magnetic, had always been known for his appetites. Even as crown prince, he cultivated a reputation as a man of pleasure. But as king, his behavior no longer needed restraint. The eyes of the nation adored him. He could charm the public with gestures of generosity, disarm politicians with bold declarations, and enchant women with his charisma. For Louise, this meant her marriage bed was not hers alone, and the role of wife was one she performed in public, not one she lived in private. The court accepted this imbalance with resignation. The 19th century, steeped in double standards, tolerated infidelity from kings as long as it remained discreet, or even when it did not. Charles fathered illegitimate children, and though tongues wagged, no punishment followed. Ministers did not chastise him. Nobles did not object. The people preferred their king dazzling rather than faithful. And Louise? She endured in silence. Each mistress was a shadow cast across her chambers. Each child born outside her marriage was a quiet stab to her dignity. She, the queen, could not command her husband's fidelity. Instead, she watched from the margins as other women occupied pieces of the life that was supposed to be hers. To the court, this was normal. To Louise, it was humiliation softened only by her refusal to speak of it. Letters and memoirs from contemporaries describe her as a figure of sad grace. She did not rage. She did not accuse. She folded her grief inward. Perhaps it was her upbringing, drilled into her by a stern Russian mother, that taught her to carry sorrow without complaint. Perhaps it was fear, that voicing pain would only expose her weakness. Either way, she chose silence, and silence became both her shield and her prison. The palace itself reflected the fracture. In its sprawling corridors, Louise occupied rooms that grew colder year by year. Charles rarely visited her chambers, preferring the company of his mistresses or the exhilaration of public life. The gulf between them widened into an abyss. They appeared together at ceremonies, sat beside one another at banquets. But when the candles were extinguished, she returned to solitude. What must it have felt like to sit in those gilded rooms, surrounded by portraits of past monarchs, knowing that history would remember her not for love, not for influence, but for endurance? To feel the ache of absence not just in the heart, but in the very air of one's home? The tragedy of Louise's marriage was not a single betrayal, but a lifetime of erasures, day after day in which her presence was overlooked. This wound deepened when the court began to view her as fragile, even irrelevant. Ministers saw the king as the center of power. Courtiers saw the mistresses as more exciting companions. Louise became the silent figure in the background, dignified but forgotten. To some, she was pitiable. To others, invisible. And yet, she was not without strength. She turned her pain toward charity, devoting herself to hospitals, orphanages, and religious projects. She found solace in helping others, even as her own soul remained unhealed. In giving, she carved out a purpose beyond the cold marriage that confined her. But charity could not mend a broken bond. Charles's infidelity was not merely private, it was political theater. By flaunting his affairs, he reminded the court that he was his own man, unbound by convention. He was the king who lived passionately, who embodied vitality. And in this theater, Louise was reduced to a foil, the pale queen, the dutiful wife, the woman whose quietness only heightened her husband's brilliance. Some chroniclers argued that she should have asserted herself, demanded respect, forced her voice into the chamber of power. But to expect that is to misunderstand her world. Louise had been raised in submission, molded into obedience. The very qualities that made her an ideal bride, her modesty, her docility, her quiet grace, were the same qualities that silenced her in marriage. She was, in many ways, a victim of the ideals imposed upon her. By the early 1860s, Louise's health began to falter more visibly. The stress of her marriage, the weight of humiliation, and the constant solitude gnawed at her. She coughed more frequently, grew thinner, and retreated deeper into her private world. The court noticed, but did little. Her suffering was background noise to the dramas of politics and the king's flamboyant escapades. And yet, Louise did not abandon her role. She continued to appear beside Charles at state occasions, her frail frame hidden beneath silks and jewels. Her eyes betrayed little. Her posture remained straight, her voice soft but steady. She embodied the paradox of queenship, humiliated in private, dignified in public. The wounds of her marriage were invisible to most, but they were real. They were wounds inflicted not by daggers or poison, but by neglect, indifference, and betrayal tolerated by society. And those wounds bled slowly, weakening her body and her spirit, until they became inseparable from her identity. In the end, the marriage of Louise of the Netherlands and Charles V was not a union, but a rupture, a bond broken almost from the start. And while he carried on with charm and audacity, she remained in her chambers, a queen draped in silence, her wounds hidden behind the heavy curtains of Stockholm's palace. For all the silence of her marriage, for all the shadows that crept into her palace chambers, there was one moment when Louise believed that life might still grant her light. That moment was motherhood. In 1851, Louise gave birth to her first child, a daughter named Louise. The court celebrated, though less fervently than they would have for a son. A princess was useful for diplomacy, but it was a prince who secured the throne. Still, for Louise, the birth was a profound joy. She had someone to love without condition, someone who would not dismiss her voice or ignore her presence. In the infant's cries, Louise heard not duty, but affection. A year later, in 1852, her second child was born, a son, Prince Karl Oscar. His arrival electrified the court. Here was the heir who would ensure continuity, the small body upon whom a kingdom's future rested. Louise's value in the eyes of others suddenly rose, as though her worth as queen had been validated only by producing a male child. Yet behind the politics, for Louise, there was only the tenderness of a mother holding her baby in the quiet hours of dawn. Those years, though brief, were the closest she came to happiness. She was still ignored by her husband, still peripheral in court politics, still plagued by fragile health. But with 2 children in her arms, she had a reason to endure. She embroidered clothes for them, read stories, and held them as though her own frailty could be soothed by their warmth. In their laughter, she glimpsed the love she had long been denied. Visitors to the palace noted a change in her then. She appeared brighter, softer, almost radiant in the presence of her children. Court diarists, who had once called her timid and sad, now described her as tender, devoted, and affectionate. The heavy silks and jewels of queenship seemed less burdensome when she walked with a child holding her hand. For a short span, the queen was not merely an ornament of monarchy, but a mother with a heart alight. Yet the world outside the nursery did not soften. Charles V continued his affairs. The court remained indifferent. Ministers and nobles still saw Louise as irrelevant to governance. Her joy existed within walls, fragile and precious, untouched by politics, but vulnerable to fate. And fate, as always, was merciless. In the winter of 1854, Prince Karl Oscar fell ill. At first it was a cough, a fever, the kind of childhood sicknesses that parents often pray will pass. But as the days wore on, his breathing grew labored. Physicians were summoned, remedies tried, but his small chest rattled with the unmistakable signs of pneumonia. Louise, already weakened by her own fragile lungs, watched with terror as the same affliction threatened to consume her child. She stayed by his bedside, refusing to leave, even as attendants begged her to rest. She stroked his hair, whispered prayers, sang lullabies that broke into sobs. The palace, usually a place of indifference to her, now carried the hush of dread. Ministers paused their debates. Courtiers exchanged nervous glances. For if the boy died, the royal line would tremble. And then, on a cold February day, Karl Oskar, not yet 3 years old, breathed his last. The kingdom mourned, but for Louise, mourning was not ceremony. It was devastation. Her joy, so fleeting, had been torn from her arms. Her son, her anchor, the child who had momentarily shielded her from loneliness, was gone. Contemporaries wrote of her collapse into grief. She withdrew into herself, pale and silent. Some said she was never the same again. Others whispered that she carried the look of a woman permanently wounded, as though death had carved lines into her face years before age would have. The political implications of Karl Oskar's death were immediate. With no surviving male heir, the line of succession grew uncertain. The court, once briefly attentive to Louise, drifted away again. Her worth, in their eyes, had diminished. The cruel arithmetic of monarchy reduced her once more to a fragile woman with a daughter, but no son. And yet, the deeper wound was not political, but personal. She had lost a child, and in that loss, she lost the one space where she had found unconditional love. The nursery, once filled with laughter, became a chamber of echoes. Lovisa remained, a daughter cherished, but also a reminder of what had been taken. Every time Louise looked at her, she saw not only the child who lived, but the brother who had died. Her health declined rapidly in the years that followed. Grief eroded her strength as surely as illness did. Her cough worsened, her frame grew thinner. Physicians prescribed rest, travel, remedies, but none could touch the wound carved into her soul. Depression settled upon her like a second disease, unseen but no less fatal. Those who saw her in this period described her as present yet absent. She attended functions, performed her duties, but her gaze often wandered, her expression detached. She had become, in essence, a woman living in the aftermath of loss, carrying grief as though it were another garment in her wardrobe. For Louise, the joy of motherhood was real. It had given her hope, purpose, and moments of genuine happiness. But fate had allowed her to taste joy only so that sorrow might cut deeper. Her life, already marked by neglect, now carried the indelible scar of a mother who had buried her son. And so the brief chapter of light in Louise's life ended. The laughter of children that had once echoed in her chambers was silenced. The queen, who had once been radiant in the glow of her nursery, returned to shadows. And the wound of loss, unlike the wounds of marriage, would never close. There are deaths in history that reshape nations. And then there are deaths that crush a single heart, silently, without changing the course of empires, but leaving one life forever broken. For Queen Louise of the Netherlands, the death of her son, Prince Karl Oskar, was the latter. To Sweden, it was a matter of succession. To her, it was the shattering of the only joy she had truly known. The winter of 1854 was particularly harsh. Snow pressed heavily against the palace windows, muffling the sounds of the city. Within those walls, the boy who was meant to secure the dynasty began to cough. At first, attendants assumed it was no more than a seasonal illness. But Louise, who knew frailty intimately, sensed the danger. She had lived her life in a body that betrayed her. She recognized the sound of lungs struggling for air. Karl Oskar was not yet 3 years old. Blonde-haired, lively, curious. He had been the apple of his mother's eye. Louise, often alone in the palace, had poured her affection into him with a quiet intensity that others scarcely noticed. She sat by him when he played, cradled him when he slept, and in his presence, her melancholy softened. To lose him was unthinkable. And yet, each day his strength faded. Physicians were summoned in haste. They prescribed poultices, broths, tonics. They warmed towels by the fire, wrapped the boy in blankets, prayed for relief. But medicine in the mid-19th century was limited. Pneumonia was a thief no doctor could restrain. Each breath he took was more shallow, each night more precarious. Louise refused to leave his side. Even as attendants pleaded with her to rest, she remained in the nursery, her frail body hunched over the small bed. Witnesses recalled her whispering prayers in Dutch, her mother tongue, as though her native language might bridge the gap between earth and heaven. She stroked his hair, kissed his forehead, pressed his tiny hands between hers as if willing her own warmth into his failing body. Charles XV came and went. He was not indifferent, but he was less constant. For him, the child's illness was tragic. Yet he believed in fate, in medicine, in the inevitability of God's will. Louise believed in none of those things. She believed only in her own terror. She clung to her son because he was not just a prince. He was the one soul who had made her life bearable. When the end came, it was quiet. Karl Oskar's small body grew still, his chest no longer rising. Louise collapsed against the bed, her sobs muffled into the sheets. A witness later wrote that her cries that night were not of a queen, but of a mother who had lost the world. The funeral was swift, as royal funerals often were. Draped banners, solemn processions, bells echoing across Stockholm. Dignitaries spoke of duty, of dynastic tragedy, of the sadness of a lost heir. But Louise heard none of it. She stood pale and motionless, her face veiled, her body trembling beneath the weight of grief. In political terms, the loss of Karl Oskar destabilized the monarchy. Without a male heir, the Bernadotte line grew vulnerable. Louise's daughter, Lovisa, could not inherit. The court began to whisper about future marriages, about distant relatives who might secure the throne. Her value, so briefly validated by producing a son, was now diminished once again. The cruel arithmetic of monarchy had reduced her motherhood to a failure. But politics meant nothing to Louise in that moment. What haunted her was not dynastic succession, but the empty cradle, the silence of the nursery, the toys left untouched, the clothes folded neatly with no child to wear them. She wandered those rooms in the days after, staring at the small shoes, the discarded wooden blocks, as if they might come alive and undo what had been done. Her grief became inseparable from her health. She had always been delicate, but now she grew skeletal. Her cough worsened, her strength ebbed. Depression, a word scarcely used then, settled upon her like a shadow. She withdrew from court life, appearing only when duty demanded. Ministers noted her absence. Courtiers remarked on her pale complexion. But few truly understood that she was living not just with illness, but with a wound that would never close. Charles XV carried on, as kings did. He consoled her in gestures, but his life resumed with politics, with mistresses, with the stage of monarchy. Louise remained trapped in private mourning, her sorrow invisible to a public eager to forget. A queen's grief was expected to be dignified, discreet, quickly buried beneath ceremony. But hers was not a grief that could be buried. It gnawed at her spirit day after day, year after year. Visitors described her as a figure fading into herself. She smiled politely, but her eyes were empty. She sat through dinners, but barely touched food. She listened to conversations, but her thoughts wandered. One court diarist wrote, "Her Majesty is like a ghost who has not yet realized she is dead." This was the turning point of her life. Before Karl Oskar's death, Louise had been fragile but hopeful. After it, she became fragile and broken. Whatever strength had carried her through an unfaithful husband and a silent court dissolved in the face of maternal loss. And yet, she endured. She rose each morning, dressed in gowns, braided her hair, walked through gilded halls. She performed the duties required of a queen. But beneath the silks and jewels, she carried the ashes of a future that would never be. History did not mark the death of Karl Oskar as a great event. Nations did not fall. Wars were not sparked. But for one woman, it was the end of joy. Louise, the queen without power, the wife without love, became from that moment also the mother without her child. And in that triad of absence, powerless, loveless, childless, her tragedy deepened beyond repair. After the coffin of Prince Karl Oskar was lowered into the earth, Stockholm returned to its rhythms. Ministers resumed their debates. Courtiers drifted back to gossip. The king, ever restless, sought distraction in politics and in women. Life, for the city, continued. But for Queen Louise, time fractured. The calendar moved forward, yet her heart remained fixed on the winter of 1854. From that season onward, she lived not as a woman of the present, but as a shadow wandering through the palace corridors. The royal palace of Stockholm, immense and imposing, became her prison. Its vast stone walls enclosed her like a tomb. In summer, the rooms were tolerable. In winter, they were freezing caverns. Drafts whistled through the long corridors, echoing like sighs of the dead. To visitors, the palace gleamed with chandeliers and tapestries. To Louise, it was an architecture of silence. A labyrinth where grief had no exit, she withdrew from social life. Where once she had joined dinners and salons, already a reluctant presence, she now declined whenever possible. At official ceremonies, she appeared thin and pale, her hands trembling as she held her gloves. Observers whispered that she looked frail, almost spectral. Her eyes seemed perpetually rimmed with sorrow, her lips pressed into lines of restraint. Inside her chambers, she lived a life apart. She read religious texts, embroidered quietly, sometimes played the piano with a soft and melancholy touch. Servants reported that she often gazed out the window for long stretches, staring across the frozen water of the harbor as if searching for something just beyond sight. She prayed frequently, lighting candles in private chapels, whispering in Dutch, her first language, as though returning to childhood faith might soothe her. The court regarded her with indifference. Ministers had no patience for grief that lingered beyond protocol. Charles XV, though not unkind, was absent in the way of men consumed by their appetites and ambitions. He comforted her in gestures, occasional visits, brief words, but soon drifted back to mistresses and politics. Louise understood this pattern too well. Her marriage had taught her not to expect companionship. But now, after the loss of her son, the absence felt unbearable. Her daughter, Princess Louise, became her consolation. The girl, bright and lively, filled her mother's heart with a fragile joy. Louise clung to her, perhaps too tightly, fearing that fate might steal her as well. She oversaw her education, guided her manners, tried to shield her from the coldness of court life. But even in this relationship, shadows lingered. Every smile from Louise reminded Louise of the smile that was missing. Every laugh carried an echo of the brother who had died. Love, in her heart, was bound to grief. Isolation deepened her frailty. Louise had never been robust, and now, under the weight of sorrow, her body began to wither. She coughed frequently, sometimes so violently that attendants feared for her lungs. Physicians advised rest, warm climates, travel to spas. She obeyed when she could, but nothing seemed to restore her. Her illness was not merely physical. It was the slow erosion of a soul worn down by solitude. In portraits of this period, Louise appears almost translucent. The artists painted her with soft features, pale skin, dark hair framing a face that seemed older than her years. Her dresses, though regal, draped over a body too thin, a figure almost lost within the fabric. One courtier remarked, "She wears the crown like a candle wears its flame, flickering, fragile, always near extinguishing." What is most tragic is that the court accepted her condition as inevitable. She was labeled delicate, and with that word, her suffering was dismissed. They pitied her, but did not intervene. They offered condolences, but no companionship. To be delicate in the 19th century was to be quietly erased, to exist as ornament rather than participant. Louise became the embodiment of that erasure. Still, she sought meaning in acts of faith and charity. She visited hospitals when her health allowed, distributing gifts to the sick. She supported orphanages, perhaps out of a longing to fill the void left by her son. She spoke kindly to servants, thanked them with genuine warmth, gestures unusual in a rigid hierarchy. These small acts did not change her loneliness, but they left impressions on those who witnessed them. Behind the fragile queen was a woman still capable of kindness, even when the world gave her none in return. At night, the palace was silent. The king was often absent, pursuing pleasures elsewhere. Louise walked the corridors alone, the sound of her footsteps swallowed by stone. Sometimes she paused at the nursery, now empty, and placed her hand on the doorframe as though touching memory itself. She returned to her chambers, lit a candle, and sat awake long into the night, coughing into handkerchiefs, her mind circling the same sorrow. In those hours, she was not a queen. She was simply a woman alone, grieving in silence, unseen by history. The tragedy of Louise's solitude lies not only in her isolation, but in the indifference that surrounded it. Had she been born in another age, she might have been remembered as a saintly figure of suffering, a queen who bore her pain with dignity. Instead, she was quietly absorbed into the background of Charles XV's reign. His charisma eclipsed her melancholy. His scandals drowned out her silence. She became, in effect, a forgotten presence in her own lifetime. But silence, too, leaves an imprint. The absence of her voice, the ghostly quality of her existence, haunted those who observed her closely. They knew she was suffering, even if they did not name it. They sensed that the queen was fading, year by year, her body thinning, her spirit dissolving into shadows. And so, Louise passed through the 1850s and 1860s like a candle burning at both ends. The palace remained full of life, balls, councils, intrigues. But for her, each day was another measure of solitude. Alone in the palace, she lived among ghosts. The ghost of her dead son, the ghost of the love she never had, the ghost of the queen she was supposed to be, but never became. For Louise, sorrow was never only of the mind. It took root in the body, wearing her down year after year until she became a vessel of illness. Even in childhood, she had been delicate. She caught colds easily, her complexion pale, her lungs weak. But grief is a cruel companion. It feeds on frailty, deepens every weakness, and hastens decline. By the 1860s, Queen Louise was visibly unwell, her fragile body mirroring the fragile place she held in the world. Her cough became a constant. It echoed in her chambers, a sharp sound against the silence. Servants grew used to seeing blood on her handkerchiefs, discreetly carried away so that courtiers would not whisper too loudly about the queen's health. Physicians diagnosed her with chest ailments, a vague phrase that, in modern language, almost certainly meant tuberculosis. In an age before antibiotics, such an illness was nearly always fatal, only a matter of time. The palace physicians prescribed the usual remedies: long rests, tonics, warm baths, gentle exercise, travel to milder climates. Louise submitted, obedient as always. She was sent to spas, to country estates, to the southern coasts where the air was softer. For brief stretches, she improved. But each time she returned to Stockholm, each time she returned to the cold palace and the coldness of her life, her health faltered again. The court saw her fading, yet did little. They described her as delicate, a word that both excused and dismissed. To be delicate was to be ornamental, like porcelain admired for its fragility, but deemed unfit for strength. They pitied her, but pity carried no cure. Ministers spoke of politics. Charles V carried on with his pleasures. Louise's health became another silent fact of palace life, acknowledged, but never truly mourned. Her illness fed upon her loneliness. Isolation breeds weakness, and Louise's solitude was absolute. The king was absent in body and in spirit, her family far away in The Hague, her son buried in the earth. Only her daughter, Princess Lovisa, remained as a flicker of warmth. Louise clung to her with the desperation of a mother who knew her days were numbered. She guided her studies, taught her languages, whispered prayers with her at night. Lovisa became her anchor, but even anchors cannot stop a body from sinking. Observers noticed how thin she became. Her gowns hung looser, her cheeks hollowed, her steps slower. She often needed support when walking long corridors. Portraits from these years show her not as a regal figure, but as a wan, exhausted woman attempting to hold herself upright beneath the weight of jewels. One visitor described her as a figure carved in glass, beautiful, but always near breaking. She sought solace in faith. Prayer became her medicine, chapels her refuge. She spent hours in devotion, seeking comfort in the promise of a life beyond the suffering of this one. Clergy admired her piety, her quiet endurance. To them, she was a model of Christian humility, a queen who accepted her cross without complaint. But for Louise, faith was less triumph than surrender. It was the only place where she could place her sorrow without fear of judgment. The more her health declined, the more invisible she became in public life. She attended fewer banquets, fewer ceremonies. When she did appear, she was carried almost like a relic, draped in silks, escorted by attendants, her smile faint and her eyes distant. The people noticed, but their attention was fleeting. They admired Charles V's vitality, his charisma, his bold gestures. They barely saw the pale figure at his side, fading as surely as candlelight in a draught. Her illness became part of the rhythm of palace life. Winter meant sharper coughs, spring a brief reprieve, summer trips to spas, autumn relapses. It was a cycle that repeated itself with cruel predictability. Each season stripped a little more from her strength. By the late 1860s, whispers spread that she would not live long, but no one knew how long. Illness, unlike scandal, carries no clear climax, only a slow erosion. And still, she endured. She read to her daughter, embroidered with trembling hands, played piano softly in her chambers. She clung to routines as though they could delay the inevitable. She visited hospitals when she could, her frail presence offering comfort to the sick, even as she herself wasted away. She became, in a quiet sense, a queen of the suffering. What makes Louise's fragility tragic is not only that she was ill, but that she was alone in her illness. Many queens before her had faced disease, but they had been surrounded by companions, courtiers, or husbands who shared the burden. Louise faced it in solitude, with only her child as witness. Her body betrayed her, her marriage abandoned her, her court dismissed her. She was alive, but in the eyes of many, she had already faded. The fragility of her body mirrored the fragility of her existence. She had been raised as a symbol, married as a pawn, crowned as a consort, but never embraced as a woman. Now, as illness consumed her, she was reduced to what she had always been in the eyes of others, a delicate figure destined not for triumph, but for disappearance. And so, the queen coughed in her chambers, prayed in silence, clung to her daughter's hand, and carried on. She was still alive, but her body was already rehearsing death. The final chapter of Queen Louise's life unfolded quietly, with none of the grandeur that had once accompanied her arrival in Sweden. By the late 1860s, her decline was unmistakable. The queen was rarely seen in public, her cough worsening, her steps faltering. Rumors circulated in Stockholm salons that she would not survive the decade. Courtiers spoke of her in hushed tones, as though she were already half absent, a living ghost within the palace walls. Her last years were a cycle of illness and recovery, but each recovery was weaker than the one before. She would rally briefly in summer, her cheeks showing the faintest trace of color, only to relapse once winter's chill returned. Physicians prescribed rest, fresh air, warm climates, but the remedies were no match for her disease. In truth, they were no match for her grief either. Louise was not only dying of tuberculosis, she was dying of loneliness, sorrow, and neglect. The world around her hardly noticed. King Charles XV carried on as usual, dividing his time between politics, entertainments, and affairs. He was not cruel. He simply lived as though her decline was inevitable, as though he could not be burdened by sorrow. The court adjusted itself in the same way, carrying on with banquets and ceremonies while their queen withered upstairs. By 1870, Louise was bedridden more often than not. She spent her days in a chamber darkened by heavy drapes, lit only by candles and the pale glow of winter light. Servants tended to her gently, aware of her weakness. Her daughter, Louise, now a young woman, stayed close, reading to her, holding her hand, offering companionship where the rest of the world had abandoned her. Letters from this period paint a haunting picture. A visitor described her as a figure almost transparent, whose voice was soft as a whisper, whose eyes seemed fixed upon another world. She had become a queen in name only, a woman whose life was slipping away unnoticed by the very court she represented. On March 30th, 1871, the end came. The city outside stirred with the sounds of spring, markets reopening, ships returning to the harbor. But inside the palace, silence hung heavy. Louise's cough had grown violent in the weeks before. Blood stained her linens. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, each one weaker than the last. Physicians attended her, but their remedies were useless. Her body was beyond their reach. She died that afternoon at the age of 42. The official cause, recorded in medical reports, was disease of the lungs, most likely tuberculosis. Yet those who knew her whispered that she died of something deeper, a life of sorrow stretched too long, a heart worn down by grief and solitude. Her death did not shake the kingdom. It was not the passing of a monarch, but of a consort whose presence had been muted for years. The newspapers reported it respectfully but briefly. There were no waves of public mourning, no uprisings of grief. Sweden and Norway carried on, their gaze fixed on their king, not their queen. In the palace, the mood was subdued but not shattered. Courtiers dressed in black, ceremonies were arranged, condolences exchanged. Yet behind the ritual, there was little genuine grief. Louise had lived too quietly, too invisibly, to command the affection of a court that had long dismissed her. The exception was her daughter. For Princess Louise, the loss was devastating. She had been her mother's closest companion, the one bond of love that had sustained Louise through illness and despair. Now, at barely 20 years old, she stood alone, the heir of sorrow. Later, she would become Queen Consort of Denmark, carrying forward her mother's legacy in ways Louise herself could never have imagined. But in that moment, she was only a daughter who had lost the one person who had always loved her unconditionally. Louise's funeral took place at the Royal Cemetery of Solna, a solemn affair marked by tradition more than affection. The coffin was draped in royal insignia, carried with formality, lowered into the ground beside other monarchs and consorts. Priests recited prayers, choirs sang hymns, and the court bowed their heads. But even then, her presence seemed overshadowed by absence. She had lived in silence, and now she was buried in silence. Some who attended later remarked on the strange atmosphere. It was not grief that dominated, but resignation. The queen had always been frail, always been overlooked, always been a figure fading at the margins. Her death felt less like a shock and more like the quiet closing of a door that had been left ajar for too long. And so Louise of the Netherlands passed into history, not with scandal, not with triumph, but with a whisper. She had been daughter of a king, wife of a king, mother of a princess. She had worn crowns and jewels, lived in palaces, and sat upon thrones, yet, at her death, what defined her was not power, but endurance. She had endured an unfaithful husband, endured the loss of her child, endured isolation, endured illness. She had endured until there was nothing left. For history, her death marked the end of a chapter barely noticed. For those who knew her, it marked the release of a woman who had carried sorrow longer than most could bear. She died at 42, leaving behind no legacy of triumph, no story of influence, only the enduring image of a queen whose fragile body and fragile soul had finally surrendered. Louise of the Netherlands was never the center of power, nor the architect of policy. She was not a queen of influence, but a queen of endurance. History nearly forgot her, eclipsed by the charisma of her husband and the turbulence of her age. Yet in her quiet life lies a truth about royalty. Crowns cannot protect against loneliness, nor jewels against grief. Louise's story is not one of glory, but of humanity, a woman who suffered, loved, and lost. In her silence, she reminds us that even queens can break quietly,